Last week, John, we were talking about school boards and we'd got up to 1902. And around that time, Herbert Asquith made a plea to Parliament, and he said this, and I'm quoting from your book, Overschooled but Undereducated: "You'll put an end to the existence of the best, most fruitful and the most beneficial educational agencies that ever existed in this country." So, what happened next with the school boards?
Of course, it's a very sad story, because what Asquith was talking about was that for the first time ever, for about 30 odd years, the English really had invested in getting local people to take responsibility, not just for the children in their own school, but for all the children in a particular community. And that went against the grain of Victorian society. And so the abolition in 1902 left the minister in London controlling virtually all the schools across the country. But those schools were now downgraded. The vast majority of them only went through to the age of 14. This was a very different time to the England that we understand. This was only 10 years before a whole crowd of people got onto the Titanic, set out across the Atlantic, and not taking any notice of natural precautions, sailed into an iceberg. They were an arrogant group. So arrogant that within 2 years, of course, we were precipitated into the First World War. And again there was an arrogance about that, because the population who had access to newspapers, but the quality of their own learning was not good, and they were conned, just as several of the Germans were, conned into saying, gosh, it'd be great fun to go and beat up the Germans. And for 4 years that's what happened. And at the end of that, England was broken. The control, the moral authority of the country disappeared. People didn't know what was happening to them. And there was the general strike of 1926. And then there was more industrial turmoil. In 1936, there was Jarrow. And all the time, as I made the comment before, by the time we got to 1939, only 18% of 14-year-olds were in school. And so Churchill was faced with a challenge in the Second World War. The population were not enthusiastic to follow orders. And so Churchill did a deal. He actually said, all right, when the war is over, we will have a full education system for everybody. And he appointed R.A. Butler. And R.A. Butler set out to establish what we now know as the 1944 Education Act. And on previous occasions I've talked about how they were guided at that stage by the psychometricians, who said that actually the only thing you really need to concentrate is working out who is intelligent enough to be educated in a grammar school, and the rest don't matter very much. So by 1944, Butler had worked all this through, the 11 plus examination had been put in place, and that's what happened for a number of years. We know the problems of that. The point I really want to make is that actually Butler tried to rescue the control of education at that stage. And rather than leaving it entirely in the hands of central government, Butler set up what he called a partnership. It was a partnership between central government that made the outline plans and local government, in effect the local education authorities, who delivered it on the ground. Now, there were 142 local education authorities, which basically meant that each was responsible for about 400,000 people. That was enormous in comparison to what the school boards before 1902 had been, or something I have a lot of time for, the school board system as it still exists in British Columbia, where in a province of only 5 million people, they have 60 school districts. But what Butler put in place were massive local education authorities. So massive that actually people didn't feel any genuine commitment to them. And so it became a battle of central government against local government. But it was more than that, because by 1965 the country had lost faith in the idea of a selective education system. People saw on their own front doorsteps when the letters came through saying one of your children's passed the 11 plus, the other hasn't, and they saw how stupid that was. And central government panicked in 1965 and said, actually, we don't like the system we put in place, but we're not going to be man enough to change it ourselves. We'll simply pass the responsibility to the local authorities to come up with local solutions which will produce comprehensive schools And they did it without any great enthusiasm. And so the greatest change that happened in English education after that was to simply leave all the 140 areas to work out their own solutions. But they weren't really locally based solutions. Each one was a sort of a watered down version of what everybody else was doing. And this really brings it to a critical date, 1976, not very long ago, when Jim Callaghan, who was then Prime Minister, realised there was total chaos, invited the general public to explore what he called the secret garden of the curriculum. And that's where we were stuck from 1976 to the present day. Nobody quite knows what they want to do.